Why do Canada geese circle a decoy spread for 20 minutes and then land in the field next to yours instead of the one you spent 2 hours setting up? Walt Hennessy, 79 years old, has hunted geese in the corn and soybean fields of Bureau County, Illinois since 1967, which was 3 years before the first major federal restrictions on waterfowl hunting changed how people thought about bag limits and population management. He started hunting geese when most hunters were still figuring out that layout blinds worked better than trying to hide behind a corn stalk. He has made every mistake there is to make with a goose spread, and he corrected each one through decades of field observation on the same ground, which is a different kind of education than anything you get from a hunting show or a YouTube channel. His education came from watching what real geese actually do when they approach a field and comparing that to what his decoys were asking them to do, and the gap between those two things was the problem he spent 30 years closing. I met Walt through a farmer I know in Bureau County who had been letting him hunt the same property for 15 years. Walt was in the field at 5 in the morning, setting decoys in the dark by himself the way he has done it every season he has been hunting, and when I asked him why his spread looked nothing like what I had been running, he walked me through the 3 differences between his setup and mine that explain why his kill-to-flock ratio on this property runs roughly triple what the previous hunters who worked the same ground produced. He was not bragging about that. He said it the same way he would have said the weather was cold. It was just what the data from the field showed him. Stay to the end. Walt has a specific adjustment he makes for geese that have already been pressured during the first 2 weeks of the season, and it directly contradicts what most goose hunters do when birds start passing high without committing. It involves removing decoys, not adding them, and it is counterintuitive enough that I want to explain the full reasoning before I get to it. Before any fieldwork happens, confirm your regulations. Canada goose hunting requires a federal duck stamp, your state's migratory waterfowl license, and HIP registration. Illinois runs specific season frameworks for different zones with different bag limits and shooting hours. The resident Canada goose population in many states has separate seasons from migratory birds, with different regulations for each. 2 minutes on the Illinois Department of Natural Resources website or your equivalent state agency before the season opens keeps everything legal. The first problem Walt identified in my spread was spacing, and it is the problem that is responsible for more failed goose hunts than any other single variable, including calling. Real Canada geese feeding in a harvested corn or soybean field in Bureau County maintain roughly 8 to 10 feet of space between individual birds. That is the width of a standard parking space. A feeding goose that has settled into comfortable feeding posture is not crowded against its neighbors. It has personal space. It is moving, picking at kernels, occasionally taking a few steps, maintaining a buffer around itself that allows it to detect and respond to ground-level threats without being bumped by the bird next to it. The average hunter sets decoys at 3 to 4 feet of spacing. That is a visual picture of geese that are either just landing, in which case the group is actively landing and there is no open landing zone, or panicked, which is how real geese look when they are squeezed together before flight by a predator. Neither of those visual pictures says to an incoming goose, "Come join us, there is food here and we are comfortable." What they say is, something has this group compressed, approach with caution. Walt runs 8 to 10 feet per decoy, minimum. On a standard morning with 24 decoys, which is his normal spread count, he covers ground that looks like a lot of empty space to a hunter standing in a layout blind. From 200 feet altitude, roughly the height of a 20-story building, which is where geese make their initial commitment assessment, it looks exactly like what it is, a feeding group using a field with the normal individual spacing that real feeding geese maintain. Incoming birds assess the spread from altitude, and their primary visual question is not how many decoys are there, but do those decoys look like birds that are safe and settled? Correct spacing is the single most powerful signal for settled birds. The math of what this means for total spread footprint is worth walking through because it is what makes most hunters uncomfortable the first time they hear it. 24 decoys at 10 feet of spacing, arranged in Walt's pod structure, covers roughly 60 to 80 yards of ground, about 2/3 of a football field in length with appropriate width. That is a large footprint. It requires more room to work with than the standard tight spread, and on fields where the hide location does not give you adequate upwind room to spread that distance, the spacing principle has to be adjusted. But on the Bureau County corn ground Walt works, which has hundreds of yards of open harvested field upwind of the fence row hide, the full spacing is achievable and the results are consistent. The setup relative to wind is the same foundational principle that governs all waterfowl field hunting. Geese land into the wind. Your hide is on the downwind edge. The spread extends upwind from your hide. The open landing zone is between your hide and the nearest decoys. Walt puts his closest decoys at 30 to 35 yards from the blind. roughly a third of the way to the pitcher's mound from home plate when converted to familiar distance, and his farthest decoys at 70 to 80 yards upwind, about 3/4 of a football field. Birds approaching into the wind cross the far decoys first, assess the full spread, and drop into the landing zone between the near decoys and the blind. The landing zone itself is 20 to 30 feet wide, roughly the width of a standard 2-car garage, and it stays completely clear of decoys. No decoys in the landing zone. The geese choose where to land based on where the open space is relative to the established group, and a clear landing zone adjacent to the near decoys is where they land. This is the same principle as the duck spread landing hole, but geese need a larger clear zone because their wingspan during landing is 6 to 7 feet, roughly the length of an adult lying flat, and they need clear air to manage that wingspan during final approach. The second element of Walt's spread is the sentry to feeder ratio, and this is where most hunters, including me before Walt corrected it, get the mix badly wrong. Standing decoys with upright heads, which represent sentry birds scanning for danger, are visually prominent, and most hunters prefer them because they look like geese from a distance. The problem is that in a real feeding group of Canada geese, the ratio of sentry birds to feeding birds is roughly 1 to 5 or 20% sentry at most. A family group of 10 birds will have 1 or 2 birds standing alert, while 8 or 9 have their heads down feeding. A spread that is 50% sentry decoys looks like a group of geese that has been disturbed and is in a state of heightened alert, which is exactly the visual picture that incoming geese read as a warning rather than an invitation. Walt runs a maximum of 4 sentry decoys in a 24 decoy spread, which is roughly 17% of the total. 20 are feeding or resting posture, heads level or down, bodies low. The 4 sentries are placed on the periphery of the spread, not in the center, because real sentry birds position themselves on the edges of the feeding group where they can monitor the surrounding area rather than in the middle where their view is blocked by other birds. A sentry decoy in the center of a spread is not where a real sentry goose stands. It is where a confused goose stands. The visual authenticity of the sentry placement matters as much as the ratio. I had been running something close to 40% sentry decoys in my previous setup because the standing decoys were visually satisfying to look at, and because I had the incorrect belief that alert birds would reassure incoming flocks that other geese had assessed the area. The opposite is true. Alert birds signal that the assessment is ongoing and concerning. Feeding birds signal that the assessment is complete and the area is safe. Walt pointed this out by asking me to watch a real feeding group in a field from a distance before setting decoys. 200 Canada geese in a harvested soybean field spread across 3 acres, maybe 1.5 football fields in area, have perhaps 15 to 20 birds standing at any given moment. The rest are heads down. The ones standing shift over 5 to 10 minutes as different birds take a turn on alert duty and others relax back into feeding. A spread that captures this ratio and this distribution looks alive in a way that a sentry-heavy spread never does. The third element is the pod structure. And this is the piece that is hardest to accept because it requires deliberately spreading your decoys into separated groups rather than one continuous mass. Walt divides his 24 decoys into 2 or 3 family-sized pods. A pod is 8 to 10 decoys arranged in a loose cluster with the individual spacing maintained within the cluster. The distance between pods is 40 to 60 yards, roughly from the outfield warning track to the center field wall in a baseball stadium. These pods represent different family groups that have landed in the same field but are using separate areas of it, which is exactly how real geese use agricultural fields in the Central Flyway during fall migration. Incoming geese are not looking for one large group. They are looking for evidence that the field is safe and being actively used by multiple groups across its area. One large continuous spread can look like an alarm cluster, geese that have piled together in response to a threat. Multiple separated pods with correct spacing within each look like a normally distributed field usage pattern. The open space between pods is not wasted space. It is landing zone for incoming birds. Geese approaching from upwind will often select the gap between pods as their landing target, which puts them in the wide open air between your decoy groups and directly in front of your hide. Walt's field experience over decades in Bureau County shows that geese on this property consistently target the pod gaps rather than the edges of the spread when approaching on a normal wind. That is the payoff location for shot opportunities, and it is completely open, giving clean shooting angles without decoys obstructing the background. You have probably had the experience of watching a flock work your spread for 2 or 3 passes and then drift off to one side and land 200 yards away in the same field. That drift almost always goes toward open ground rather than back into your spread. The flock is looking for a landing zone that is separated from the established group. which is how real geese choose landing spots to avoid conflict over food resources. If your spread has no internal separation, no pod gap, the flock has nowhere to land except directly adjacent to your decoys, which can feel crowded to birds that want their own space. A pod gap gives them what they are already looking for. They do not drift to open ground outside your spread because you have built the open ground into your spread. The failure conditions for the pod spread with correct spacing are real and worth covering directly. Opening week of the season, before migration pressure builds and before resident geese have been shot at multiple times, large crowds of geese use fields in ways that are less structured than the family group patterns Walt describes. Early season birds are often in larger, less differentiated aggregations, and a big spread with looser restrictions can produce results as good or better than the pod structure during this period. Walt runs a simplified version of his pod spread early season, 2 pods of 12 rather than 3 pods of 8, with slightly less strict spacing, because early season birds are not yet making the careful altitude assessments that educated late season birds make. Layout blinds and chisel-plowed ground present a different hide challenge than fence row hides, and the spread orientation has to account for a hide that is in the middle of the field rather than on the edge. Walt prefers fence row and ditch hides when available because the spread can extend in a single direction and the landing zone is naturally positioned in front of the hide. In a field hide with layout blinds on flat open ground, he adjusts by orienting his pods so that the landing zone gaps are directly over the layout blind positions rather than in front of an edge. Birds coming in from any direction will target the pod gaps, and the layout blind positions need to be under those gaps rather than adjacent to them. The layout blind itself requires a different kind of discipline than a fence row hide for the 4-second stillness window that matters on committed geese. I covered this principle in a previous duck video, and it applies directly here. From the moment a goose flock locks its wings on final approach, no movement from any hunter in the blind until the flock is inside 25 yards, roughly the distance from the batter's box to the front edge of the pitcher's mound. Geese at 40 yards can detect a human face rising from a layout blind, and the abort is immediate. Inside 25 yards, rising slowly and consistently produces clean opportunities on birds that are fully committed to landing. What I want to get to now is the pressured bird adjustment that Walt described last and that I promised at the bridge. This is the technique that goes directly against what most hunters do when early season success drops off and birds start passing high. The standard response to geese that are passing high without committing is to add decoys. Larger spread, more motion, more flags. The theory is that more visual mass will pull reluctant birds down. Walt's observation from Bureau County over 40 years is that this approach makes the problem worse on birds that have already been hunted multiple times. A goose that has survived 3 or 4 field hunts in the past 2 weeks has developed a learned association between large decoy concentrations and danger. The visual picture of a large spread is now a warning signal rather than an invitation for a pressured bird. Walt's pressured bird adjustment removes decoys rather than adding them. He drops from 24 decoys to 12, arranged in a single pod of 8 to 10 birds with 4 to 6 spread loosely downwind as if they just landed and are walking toward the main group. The landing zone is larger. The spread is smaller. The visual impression is of a very small, very relaxed family group that has just settled into the field, not a full hunting operation. The flagging stops completely. The calling drops to 1 or 2 soft clucks rather than the aggressive double cluck and comeback calling that works on fresh birds. The logic is that pressured geese are not avoiding open fields. They are avoiding what they associate with danger in open fields, which is the visual and audio signature of a hunting operation. A small, quiet, correctly spaced pod of 12 decoys with no motion and no calling looks like what it is supposed to look like. A small family group feeding without alarm. It does not look like anything a pressured goose has learned to avoid. Walt says his late-season results on the Bureau County property, after mid-season pressure has educated the local birds, are actually better per flock opportunity with the 12 decoy small pod setup than with his full 24 decoy spread earlier in the season. He attributes this entirely to the pressured bird behavioral adjustment. A goose that will not look at 48 decoys will still land on 12 if the 12 look right. The gear for field goose hunting in central Illinois is worth covering because the setup differs from water hunting in specific ways. Walt runs full-body Canada goose decoys for his pod birds, a mix of feeding and resting postures from manufacturers that focus on realistic body shape rather than surface detail. The full bodies he runs are GHG, which hold up to field conditions and stack efficiently for transport. He does not run shell decoys in the main pods because shells read differently from altitude than full bodies on flat ground without snow cover. And snow shells work well because the snow fills the shadow under the shell and reduces the artificial flatness. On bare ground, shells read as flat shapes rather than 3-dimensional birds. His gun is a Remington 870 in 12 gauge with a modified choke running heavy-shot steel 3-inch loads in BB size. At the 20 to 30 yard distances his spread geometry produces, BB shot through a modified choke provides adequate pattern density for clean kills without the pellet gaps that a tighter choke can create at close range. The 870's manual action cycling means a conscious second shot that does not happen reflexively, which Walt says prevents him from shooting after the flock has flushed rather than during the commitment window. He has made peace with a pump gun at 79 because he knows exactly how many shells he is going to fire on any given morning, and he plans accordingly. The field note Walt mentioned as we were finishing the setup that has stuck with me. The first time he ran the 12 Decoy pressured bird spread in mid-November on the Bureau County ground about 20 years ago, his hunting partner thought the setup looked embarrassingly small and said so explicitly. 15 minutes after shooting light, a family group of 9 Canada geese dropped straight into the landing zone without circling, without flagging, without calling from the blind. Walt killed 2. His partner was still processing the fact that it had worked. The spread that looked too small to attract anything had produced the cleanest, fastest commitment of the entire season. Decoy count is not confidence. Spacing, ratio, and pod structure are confidence. Walt understood that somewhere around his 15th season in Bureau County and spent the next 40 years refining what that understanding looks like in practice. Run the spacing on your next setup. Set your near decoys at 35 yards from the blind, roughly from the mound to just past the base path, and your far decoys at 75 yards, about 2/3 of a football field. Keep 8 to 10 feet between each bird. Hold the sentry count to 4 out of 24 or fewer. Build 2 pod gaps and put your blinds under the gaps. See what the first flock does when it reaches altitude over your spread. The birds will tell you whether it is working.